Dominic. I'll be presenting on the Proxy War, or the Soviet Union's effects on Vietnamese independence. The purpose of this project was to look at America as a world power, but through the lens of the Vietnam conflict, and specifically the Soviet Union, and how this changed and affected Americans' ideas of how they interacted in the world stage. So this was my thesis, and that it was that Vietnam's close ties to the Soviet Union led to the initial intervention in Vietnam by the United States, but the diplomatic and military aid that they provided Vietnam was actually crucial to allowing Vietnam, or specifically North Vietnam, to maintain its independence. And that was just a question I had in class as to how much the Soviet Union actually helped or hurt, whether had they not been in the region at all, Vietnam would have actually maintained its independence easier, or if the conflict would have been not as difficult. But I found that even with the U.S. intervention, their support that the Soviet Union gave North Vietnam was actually much more helpful than harmful. The paper looked at the Vietnam War through Soviet eyes, and both the North Vietnamese and the Soviets saw this as an imperialistic war by the United States. This was a war not necessarily for resources, but for control, one that maintained colonial and imperialist power, first maintained by the French in the region, and now, in the Soviet view, the United States, just another Western imperialist coming in to control the region, trying to take its resources. But I wanted to look at the war through a pragmatic lens, not an ideological lens. So this wasn't communism versus diplomacy or democracy. This was pragmatic actors on the world stage, realpolitik. What were their options? What were they trying to weigh in sort of in favor and out of favor? And so I wanted to look at North and South Vietnam as pawns in this battle between the great powers. But for the US, I do want to point out it was not an imperialistic mission. Everything from internal documents does not suggest that they wanted Vietnam to be the next colony or anything like that. It was just a matter of maintaining credibility. So that is sort of what led me to believe that this was a pragmatic matter more than an ideological matter. So let's begin with early diplomatic support. So as early as a decade before troops actually landed on the ground in Vietnam, the Soviet Union was providing diplomatic aid to North Vietnam to try to gain its independence. So this began at the Geneva Conference, which we've already sort of talked about. But something that came out of this conference was allowing North Vietnam and Vietnam generally to have diplomatic elections after a period of time, which the United States understood would have meant communist control of Vietnam. So these diplomatic elections did not actually occur, but the Soviet Union did push for Vietnam to have an election system as opposed to something different that would allow Western powers to take over. And then there was lots of private meetings. One of these is specifically Foreign Minister Gromyko and U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk. And this is where I get this idea that the Soviets thought this was an imperialistic mission, because Foreign Minister says quite directly, why do you have troops in Vietnam? Is this an imperialistic mission? If you really meant what you say, you would pull the troops out and let Vietnam do what it will do. And so it's really direct communication. I was very surprised by how non-veiled these talks were about what are your intentions in Vietnam. So here's just a picture of that. And then military support was the majority of my paper, because once the troops actually landed on the ground, once intervention was very clear, the Soviets and Chinese provided lots of actual military aid to Vietnam, and a lot of this was in the form of anti-air guns, but not and anti-air weapons, so surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, as well. But these also came with military specialists, so that AAA gun is not just coming with ammunition and the gun itself, but also with a Russian expert on how to use it, to train the Vietnamese to use it. And this was a big factor in the war, because the US saw not a full-scale war, but a limited war in which they emphasized air warfare, bombing, strategic strikes, and wanted to limit the amount of boots on the ground. And so their presence was largely air-based, and so these anti-air guns actually put American pilots in much more dangerous situations than they would have been otherwise, because North Vietnam was not industrialized enough to actually build an air defense network capable of repelling the American Air Force. So this is a direct quote from an F-4 Phantom pilot, one of the many airplanes used in the Air Force at the time. And it describes how the SAMs really affected their ability to perform missions, but also how it got them to fly lower to avoid these SAMs, but then they would be hit by flak guns. I found statistics that showed that a majority of the air-to-air, or the kills of American aircraft were actually from flak guns and not necessarily SAM sites. And that is because of this air defense network that Vietnam was able to erect, thanks largely to the Soviet Union and China. And so this also had another effect on Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the bombing campaign. It affected the decision-making in the White House. Because the Americans knew that Vietnam had Soviet specialists and Soviet troops also on the ground, it changed the targets that they selected. They avoided Hanoi and northern Vietnam for the longest time because they did not want to cause Soviet casualties, believing that this would lead to basically World War III, or at least a large escalation. And so it really changed the way that McNamara, Lyndon B. Johnson, all of the people in the White House saw the conflict. It was about avoiding war with the Soviets, not necessarily winning. It was sort of both, but it was something that they had to think about the whole time that they were involved. But this also shows how Vietnam was a sort of bargaining chip for these greater powers. The Soviet Union used Vietnam both in its negotiations with China and with the United States. And so with the United States, it was later, mostly in the 70s, a tool for trying to reopen negotiations. Let's have peace in Vietnam, let's both pull out. But in order to renegotiate and have these diplomatic sort of talks again, they needed to settle peace. And so that allowed the Soviet Union to put diplomatic pressure on the Soviets, using Vietnam basically as the tool to do that. But then this also happened with China. At the time, the Vietnamese, especially the Vietnamese leadership, was divided between a pro-Chinese and a pro-Soviet faction because largely communism had a split, the Sino-Soviet split, in which half of the communist world wanted to go with the Soviets and the other half with China. And so Vietnam was the terrain in which both sides could show why they should be the leader of the communist world. And so the Soviet aid was really a way to show other communists why the Soviets were the rightful sort of leaders of this. And it was also very dependent on that power struggle between the Chinese and the Soviets. So it was always dependent on China. If China increased aid, the Soviets needed to increase aid as well, or at least maintain aid in order to not lose that international standing. And so, as much as Vietnam was a pawn, Vietnam also played that great game itself by waging these greater powers against each other to gain more support for independence. So military support actually helped Vietnam. This is a quote from McNamara himself, showing how Operation Rolling Thunder was not as effective as they wanted it to be because a lot of supplies and a lot of these arms actually went through, not only to North Vietnam, but to South Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so this bombing campaign was not as effective, not only because of anti-air weapons, but just because of the amount of supplies that North Vietnam was receiving. So eventually, in the 70s, both great powers, all three great powers even, wanted to leave Vietnam. This was becoming too costly. It was not gaining any of them enough pragmatically to actually stay within the conflict. And so this led to renewed diplomatic pressure from the Soviet Union to the United States about leaving the conflict and not needing to have been in the area in the first place. And so it actually helped the Vietnamese gain independence by advocating early and throughout the whole war for Vietnamese independence, that Vietnam should be free of American intervention. And so pragmatically, what this allowed all three great powers to do is to leave the region with minimal hits to credibility. So they all fulfilled their ideological sort of slogans the Americans fought for democracy, the Soviets fought for communism, so did the Chinese. They've all accomplished their goals, now they can leave, but if all three of them leave at once, that does not put the blame on any one of them more so on the international stage than another. And so what this means for America as a world power is that it's not about the actual effects of its actions, but how they are perceived. It's more about the perception, the international perception, the home front perception of their actions. And that is more important to America than actually achieving the goals, military goals at least, in Vietnam. Because doing nothing in Vietnam would have decreased international credibility, but going for a full-scale war would have also decreased credibility at home. And so they were stuck in this sort of half and half, where they needed to not appear weak, but not necessarily go all the way in to achieve military victory. And so the greater point is that America will prioritize credibility abroad or domestically over military or greater ideological goals. So this is seen in Vietnam, but also in recent Middle Eastern conflicts as well. Thank you.